Thank you so much, beautiful people of the world, for joining us today. I am so grateful that we are combined once more. And today we are going to be led in knowledge and wisdom by Dr. Justin Fielder on the Thoughtful Leader Strategies for Developing Resilience and Self-Awareness. With that being said, I did want to share with you some of the expertise that we have at our hands today. Dr. Fielder is not only a certified fraud examiner, he's also a transformative leader with over 2 decades of experience spanning the gamuts of law enforcement, the private sector, and the U.S. Armed Forces. Thank you for your service. He has successfully led large, diverse teams in high-stakes environments. He's also fostered collaboration and has delivered strategic outcomes. When asked about his leadership approach, he would share that he's grounded in emotional intelligence and continuous learning. Moreover, he's driven impactful results in complex investigations and high-impact initiatives. As I get to know him a little bit more, Justin has a proven ability to optimize resources and implement innovative solutions, enhancing both diversity and operational efficiency across sectors. He not only is a blazer from University of Alabama at Birmingham, he also completed his PhD at Nova Southeastern University, so he brings to us the expertise of the Sharks, a member of the esteemed AFIA. This is his first time presenting with Black Doctoral Network. As a value add, Dr. Fielder is also an executive coach with the Dr. J. Way Thoughtful Leadership System. That contact is listed in the chat. And for those who are listening remotely, he can be reached at Dr. J. Way, W-A-Y, LLC at gmail.com. Last but not least, with a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution, he is deeply committed to leadership excellence and the development of high-performing teams. At this point, I am glad to have the Black Doctoral Network present as its inaugural speaker of the fall 2024 season, Dr. Justin Fielder.
And I appreciate that introduction. All those big words and everything boils down to one thing. All those words mean nothing unless what I'm going to talk about today is implemented as part of a leadership process, and that is being thoughtful, a thoughtful leader. So, when we talk about leadership, and I'm very passionate about leadership. It's one of the things that I have learned. I never thought when I first started my career that I would enjoy leading others as much as I do. But I've developed a really, really deep passion for it. So, and throughout my journey, what I've realized is that the best leaders I've encountered have been ones that I deem as thoughtful leaders. So this picture today I chose is essentially, it embodies peace and stability, but leadership is anything but peace and stability. If anybody who's in leadership roles, if you know how to reach a point where leadership always looks like this, you've probably figured out something that the world has never, ever figured out before, because leadership, as well as life, just doesn't work like that. You rarely reach a point of stasis or equilibrium in leadership. So that's why it's important to develop resilience and self-awareness. So as I take you through this presentation, there's going to be some things that sort of overlap with one another, That's because all of these, like resilience and self-awareness, and we'll talk about emotional intelligence, it all sort of overlaps and combines, and it goes hand in hand. So this is me, as was stated earlier, certified coach and conflictologist. Uh, that's because I really have a keen um, sense of wanting to learn really about how we can use conflict to become better. So before we start, I just want to sort of engage you all, that everybody that's on right now, with this scenario. So some of the scenarios I'll talk about are actually based on some of my leadership experience. So if you don't mind, or if you're able, come off mute on camera, and I just want to know your thoughts on this. So I'll just kind of read through this. Corey has been a senior leader in his organization for the past 3 years. He consistently receives positive reviews from his supervisor. Overall, he is well received by his team. He is also in line for an upcoming promotional opportunity. However, Corey has a couple of team members who seem to hold a grudge against him for not allowing them to move forward with some projects they wanted to work on. So recently, Corey's boss called him in for a meeting, and his boss received an anonymous complaint. That anonymous complaint alleged that Corey has been screaming and yelling at employees. The complaint also alleged that Corey belittles employees. And Corey knows he's never done any of these things alleged in the complaint. And reading the email, he's relatively certain he knows who authored it. So there's an extremely bitter person on his team who's angry because Corey was selected for his current position in lieu of him. And Corey believes this is a mean-spirited attempt to prevent him from obtaining the current promotional opportunity. So I just want to pose this out. If you can put yourself in this type of situation, how do you feel you would react if you know that you've really tried to do good by your people, and you definitely know that you've never screamed and yelled at employees, and pretty much this whole thing is manufactured, and you have a pretty good idea who on the person on your team who manufactured this? How would you react to that? And I pose that question.
I like, Dr. Fielder, how our audience participants are thinking. I'm going to be quiet and let them chime in. I do have some ideas myself, though.
And again, this is the way that you feel you would respond. This is not a textbook thing.
I feel like for me, I wouldn't jump into it or overreact or anything. I would I'm kind of the person where I let my work speak for itself, especially if other people, along with higher management, has seen my quality of work and know how I kind of respond to situations. I wouldn't try to, scream down their throat or anything, saying they're a liar or anything like that.
Okay. So you would just not address it. You would kind of leave it be, and just let your work speak for itself, is basically what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. I appreciate that, Cohen. Anybody else?
Yes, Justin. I would be upset, but I would strategically find a way to engage that person, not letting him know that I knew what my theory was, that I thought it was him, but I would find a way to try to engage him and him or her, and try to see if I could bring them around to see my vision.
Okay. Outstanding. Anybody else?
Hi, can you all hear me okay? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So, for myself, I would, if this is a team, I would take them all or bring them out to lunch, or have lunch brought in, catered, and just have some conversations, maybe some team building activities, or, I'm trying to find out, and trying to confirm my suspicion. And people tend to talk more, they're happier when they're eating. So that's how I would handle that and follow up. Anything that I do or any time that I'm speaking to the person in question, it would be via email with others CC'd on it until we got
Okay.
to the bottom of it.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Appreciate that, Dr. How you pronounce that? German?
It is German. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Excellent. All right. Anybody else before we move to the next? All right. Well, appreciate your input. And yeah, definitely great answers, or great responses, or great approaches. So let's talk about these workshop objectives. So I'm going to get a clear on, I hope to, the part, what I impart to y'all, you get a pretty clear understanding of thoughtful leadership and how self-awareness and resilience are critical components of thoughtful leadership. And hoping you can, in some way, identify some areas where you can enhance your self-awareness, whether that's, your personal strengths, emotional triggers, and probably, identify some areas of growth. Also, cultivate resilience. Again, we'll look at some practical strategies to help build mental, emotional, and leadership resilience when you face that adversity that's gonna come. And then we'll look at some ways to apply emotional intelligence to leadership. And that's, understand how emotional intelligence enhances your ability to lead, how it's such a critical component of leadership. And then maybe create a personal leadership development plan. So what that may look like is, leaving this presentation, you'll think about some books or some courses or some things that I can point out that you can commit to doing to, again, enhance your leadership journey. And we start with, if we ask what leadership is, you're going to get a different response from a lot of different, you're going to get a lot of different responses. That's a very multifaceted concept with lots of definitions. But what are some key attributes to leadership? Vision. Vision is a key attribute to leadership. You want a leader who can really look forward, think forward. Leaders who can't see, or can really only see what's in front of them and don't have the ability to really expand their vision tend to be pretty challenging leaders to deal with. Decision making. You want leaders who are pretty good at decision making. They're good at not only making informed, but strategic decisions. And that goes over into the vision part of it. In leadership, you want to have the ability to think out and make strategic decisions, particularly the higher you go or you progress in your leadership journey. That strategic part and that vision part becomes very, very critical. And then influence. In leadership, you want to be able to influence or inspire and motivate others to support your vision. Simply ordering people or trying to force them or coercing them, that's not what you want to aspire. That's not the type of leader you want to aspire to be. Now, there is the concept of situational leadership that I am very, very a strong fan of, meaning there are situations where you're going to have to be direct with people and tell them what you want done and why you want it done, or when you want it done. You have to be direct because some of these things or these strategies that you try to use, they just won't respond to it. So there is situational leadership where you have to, again, use those direct approaches. But overall, you want to have the ability to influence. And empowerment. I think we all enjoy a leader, a manager who has trust in us, that, shows us that they have faith in our abilities and they want us to grow. So you want to have a leader that's going to empower the organization and their team. So then we drill down into this concept of thoughtful leadership. Thoughtful leaders are intentional, deliberate in their actions, and they align their decisions with the values and goals of the organization. Meaning, it's not all about that leader. It's about the organization and the people, rather. They're people focused. Reflective. Thoughtful leaders want to regularly pause and reflect on their performance, and they seek feedback, and not only good feedback, because I'm going to tell you, it's the sting of bad feedback. As humans, we tend to not like that sting we feel when we receive bad feedback. But that's what thoughtful leaders do. They're reflective and self-aware. Thoughtful leaders understand their strengths, weaknesses, and biases. This is critical. And they can constantly try to develop and build their emotional intelligence. This is all going to inform that thoughtful leadership journey. Then empathetic. Thoughtful leaders see and have genuine care for the people that they lead. People aren't just numbers or, a means to an end. They actually take care in the well-being and the welfare of the people they lead. And they're adaptable because things are going to constantly change. So you have to be adaptable. And then, of course, resilient. Thoughtful leaders are resilient because there are always going to be challenges and setbacks, always. So you must, as a thoughtful leader, you must be resilient. And I tell you, my apologies. I see that when I pull this over, some of the slides didn't translate properly. So apologies for a little of the text that's off. But if you have trouble seeing or reading anything, please let me know and I'll clarify it. And if you have any questions or anything, please feel free to put them in the chat, Monique. And if you don't mind, I may not see it, so feel free to stop me if anybody has any questions.
No worry.
And the role of self-awareness in leadership. So we just talked about this, but one of the key things here is emotional triggers. It's very, very important to identify your emotional triggers and learn how to manage them, because one of the last things you want to do, particularly in a leadership role, and again, I'll talk about the higher you go, the more visible you become, you can ill afford to allow yourself to lose control. And if you have to work on identifying things that really trigger you, so that you can learn how to recognize when it's happening. And that way you don't lose control. You need to be able to respond calmly and with clarity. You need to understand how your emotions and behavior affect others. So self-aware leaders understand that anxiety goes down. So if you're an anxious leader or you're very emotional about certain things, imagine how that reverberates down the organization. So imagine a CEO really exhibiting very high emotional behavior and or emotions, and just imagine what kind of impact that would have on an organization. So again, the higher you go, the more it's important to hone these different skill sets and learn how to be a more self-aware leader. Then improve decision making. Obviously, it being more thoughtful impacts how you make decisions. And you just thoughtful leaders tend to be more likable people. They have strong relationships, and they constantly try to continue building and maintaining relationships. So just to engage you all, who among you considers yourself to be pretty self-aware? And then why or why not? All right, Monique, tell us about this.
I would say that I consider myself to be self-aware One, because in my doctoral studies, I'm studying leadership, so that causes me to bring the lens onto oneself. Additionally, as an educator and a community leader, it is a best practice to have reflection in one's professional work. With that being said, I tend to take a pause, take a beat to check in with myself to see what I could improve or change to enhance the experience of my stakeholders.
Okay, excellent. Anybody else consider yourself to be self-aware or not?
Yes, I'm self-aware. I pay attention to detail very well. I believe in providing a quality product, especially in my sector. I'm in the federal law enforcement sector. So, yeah.
Okay, excellent.
So I have a question.
Yep, go ahead.
Is there such a thing as perhaps selective self-awareness where you're pretty much self-aware, but there are times that you deliberately don't want to be self-aware?
Well, so that's interesting. An interesting point you raised. So I would say you're self-aware because let's I'll give an example. Say you have someone on your team that you know is of a different political ideology than you are. And you and that person have had discussions and you just decide that you don't like that person because they are of a different political party than you are. So you're self-aware. You're like, I don't like this person because of that. And let's say, an opportunity for promotion comes up or something comes and you say, well, I'm not gonna promote that person because I don't like them because they, again, they're in a different political party and I just don't like their belief system. So I don't think you be in that case disregarding your self-awareness. You're aware of it. It's just you're choosing not to lean into it and figure out how you can move past that bias. Is that kind of what you were referring to?
Yes, that is a very real example. Yes. Thank
Yeah,
you.
you will. So again, this is what I'm saying is that there's some deeper levels of work that need to be done. So self-awareness is just one part of it, but then you need to, really work on what do you do with those biases or those negative emotions that you may have towards a certain person or things that may impact your decision making as a leader. That's where a lot of the work starts coming into, and that's where the constant work comes in at. Because I'm sure we all know these people who recognize they are who they are, but they just really don't care how, the impact of their behavior. And that's why we go back to that other thing is understanding how your behavior impacts others. And some people just don't care. And we talk about resilience in leadership, which is bouncing back from challenges, the ability to adapt and bounce back from those constant changes and setbacks, and to keep your composure. And the key thing is keeping that composure and pushing forward even when you really just don't want to. And this happens constantly in leadership and will happen constantly. So it's important to recognize how you develop that resilience. How do you do it? And to always think about how you respond to certain setbacks. You're human. You're entitled to feel, you're human. You're going to feel a certain range of emotions. But again, as a leader, particularly as a thoughtful leader, you have to, again, embrace resilience. So one of my favorite quotes is from Marcus Aurelius, meaning you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find your strength. And essentially what he meant by that is you can do a lot of different things and apply a lot of different techniques. However, when it comes to leadership and maybe even dealing with a certain person or something, but you can't control how people react or how certain environments react to you. But what you are in control of is the way you respond to certain people's actions or different things that happen. That you're for the most part in control of, and as long as you have of a sound mind, sound body and mind. So with that being said, this again goes into this thoughtful leadership, because you really want to learn how to, how to be thoughtful in your response to certain things and your decision making. So Nelson Mandela, if you've never read his, instead would be his autobiography, if you've never read it, you should really read it or just study on him, because he embodies the essence of resilience. And I mean, to be imprisoned for fighting against the apartheid system in South Africa, and I think he was in prison for 26, 27 years, somewhere thereabout. And like I was reading that he, because he was rather tall, he would have to sleep with his, the cell was so small, he kind of have to like sleep with his knees bent up because he couldn't stretch all the way out. And just the conditions in that prison, were horrible. And to spend that much time, and he did a lot of deep reflections. If you read his prison letters and such, he's very reflective. And when he came out, he was able to become the president of South Africa, and he did not go after the people who had wronged him. So he embodied resilience. And that's a whole other level of resilience, but it's just something, if you really want to look at someone and try to emulate just even a fraction of some of the things that they did in their character, like he embodies that level of resilience. So one of the key things here in resilient leadership, which again is a whole other component unto itself, but is a part of this thoughtful leadership process, is what's termed as VUCA, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And this is all in the leadership world. Volatility. By show of hands, or who, if there's anybody in, I say a leadership role, because we're all leaders and we're all leaders in our own respect, but did anybody lead any projects or any people during the COVID? Okay. So it was volatile, right? It was unpredictable. It happened overnight. It's volatile. It was uncertain. We really didn't know. We couldn't predict, they tried. We didn't know how fast it would spread, all these things that were going on in, during COVID. But if you think back to your organizations, how your organizations flipped on their heads and, tried to, even right now, you see what's happening with Amazon and some of the other places calling people back to work and things like that. There was so much uncertainty around that time. And, but if you're leading, you had to do your best to manage all of that. So it was volatile, uncertain, complex. The complexity of even that, or we even take, I take right now, the complexity, the interconnected nature of multiple factors. And look at the economy. I don't know about you all, but you try to read about, the different candidates' plans, or you try to understand what's going to be best for the economy and what's not. It's complex, because you're going to get different schools of thoughts. But these leaders are trying to make this complex issue to where we can try to understand it. And it's hard to do. The one thing to remember in leadership is that it's a holistic approach, and you have to take a systems thinking approach. This goes into dealing with your people and your resources. So as a thoughtful leader, you have to bear in mind that you have to maintain that vision, that clarity, and just remember that you have to work with your resources and your people to try to make these sound decisions. Again, because each part of the system affects the other part. It's not just about you. And ambiguity. That is what, a good example would be, again, when if you listen to different takes on the presidential candidates, you might hear, well, this person is explaining, they're not doing a good job explaining their stance on the economy. That person's not doing a good job explaining their stance on it. That's where this ambiguity comes in, because that's a very challenging thing as a leader, to understand how to communicate a vision or decisions in a clear and concise manner when all of these things are going on: volatility, uncertainty, complexity. It's hard. It's very challenging. That's where this term VUCA comes in at. And this is a good thing, because this is a way to help you as a thoughtful leader, a person in leadership, learn how to frame your approach to all of this. So you keep this VUCA and you understand and you try to chunk away at each of these concepts. I'm not saying magic will happen, but it'll help you really start developing a good approach to your leadership, particularly when you start, when you encounter all these different issues and challenges. Just remember that people running for the highest office in the land have a challenge connecting all these things. And there's a reason for it. And that's where we get into this resilient leadership. That in itself is a really huge component of navigating the VUCA landscape. And some of the building blocks of resilience: positive self-talk. You don't want to constantly beat yourself down as a thoughtful leader. You want to have positive conversations with yourself. I have a leadership model that I developed, which is based on my military experience with land navigation and being out in the woods at night alone, trying to make it to a certain objective. The wisdom later on in life that I learned from that is that I had to, in order to get to accomplish that goal of making it to my certain objective, I had to engage in positive self-talk with myself. I'm out there by myself. There's nobody there to hype me up, pep me up. It's me. I had to constantly remind myself, you know what you're doing. You know where you're going. It's okay. You're not lost. You have to do that as a thoughtful leader. You have to learn how to positively reinforce yourself and not constantly destroy your psyche with negative talk. We talked about emotional intelligence, strong relationships. Yes, you definitely need strong relationships, because you do. You need those. You need those cheerleaders. You need those support systems, and you need cognitive flexibility. So there's a concept called cognitive reframing, and in cognitive reframing, it is essentially taking situations and thinking about them differently. So the best example would be glass half empty, half full, right? If you've constantly going through situations with it half empty, looking at life half empty, that's just not a good way to approach it. But if you think of it half full, right? That's probably one of the most common examples. But to be able to reframe certain situations and have that flexibility to not get stuck in a certain pattern of thinking will do wonders for you in your in building your resilience. So all of these things connect together because you need all of them to foster resilience. So this is the emotional intelligence piece of it. So leaders who embody emotional intelligence tend to be more adept at building strong and trust-based relationships with their teams and fostering a positive environment. Oops, sorry about that. And again, this is a very critical aspect of this whole thoughtful leadership process. We hear this term emotional intelligence. It's become quite the buzzword, I would say, over the past few years. And there's a reason for it, because a lot of organizations are starting to really find out, or not really find out, but starting to lean into the fact that you can have some of the most technically savvy, when I say technically savvy, technical in their, in whatever organizational position they're in, they could know it inside and out. They can know the ins, the outs. But if they lack some of these critical components of emotional intelligence, all of that could be for nothing, because they could destroy morale. So there's a pivot to what is being termed as soft skills, which embodies this emotional intelligence and communication. But those are hard skills, because a lot of people have challenges leaning into these things. So the 5 domains of emotional intelligence, we talked about self-awareness. We talked about empathy. And then self-regulation, just as I mentioned, if you don't try to master the ability to regulate your emotions and your thoughts, again, just imagine the fallout of that as many of us want to ascend higher in our leadership journey. And when I say higher in these organizational hierarchies, we want to keep moving up, upward. It's imperative that you learn how to regulate your emotions, because again, the higher you go, the more that reverberates down across the organization. And the example I gave is, imagine the top person in an organization spazzing out in front, like they do a town hall or something, and they just spaz out and they lose control, and they say, maybe they say, oh, this organization is going down the drain. What's going to happen? If you're in the private sector, you probably investors and stuff like that are going to probably start pulling out. People are going to start looking for other jobs. You're going to incite panic. You can't do that. You can ill afford to do that. You have to learn how to regulate those emotions. And that is a domain of emotional intelligence. Social skills, that ability to communicate effectively and build relationships and influence others. Does this mean that you have to be a social butterfly? No, it doesn't. But you do have to gain a mastery in communication, communicating with others. And that looks differently to everybody. So you really have to learn how to maneuver in these environments. And once again, it doesn't mean that you have to be somebody that you're not. It doesn't mean that you have to be a social butterfly when you're not. But you do need to learn how to communicate effectively across your team and to build these relationships. And then lastly, motivation. You need that intrinsic motivation. And Simon Sinek, if maybe a lot of us have seen his YouTube videos or have come across his books, and then that book Start With Why is a part of this. Is what is your motivation for leadership? What is your motivation to continue doing what it is that you do? And you have to constantly keep that. And it may change, it may vary a bit, but that is intrinsic, it's inside of you. it keeps going. That's what's going to keep you going on your leadership journey and keep you in the, in a I say a journey towards that North Star, which is a positive direction, by having that, identifying that key motivation that keeps you going. And it'll help prevent you from becoming soured by a lot of the different things that you will encounter as a leader. And again, this is some of the overlap. And this is what I mean by that, is that some of the things we discussed about emotional regulation. And one of the key things I want to talk about is understanding how this impacts you, how this affects you with conflict. A lot of people you hear the word conflict and they go the other direction. Again, show of hands or emojis, anybody, when you hear the word conflict, do you develop a negative thought process with that? So yeah, you hear the word conflict, and yeah, it automatically screams negative, bad. But conflict is not always bad, and sometimes it's necessary. It's the type of conflict that is destructive. There's constructive and there's destructive conflict. So constructive, what happens if you've ever been on a working group or working on a project with somebody, or life in general, some of the best ideas are born because you're having different ideas or thought processes. But again, it's constructive when you apply all these emotional intelligence and self-awareness, when you apply these different things and you respond to it in a positive manner. Then you could leverage that conflict and great things are born out of it. I mean, what happens, as they say, I hate to use this, but they say when a bone breaks, it comes back stronger. I don't really want to roll with that one because I don't understand the true medical perspectives behind it. But there are like controlled burns on pastures and stuff like that, which we equate that to bad, right? If it's something that's burned, we see it as bad. It's destroying it. But they do that a lot of times so that grass will come back much better. So conflict is sort of like that, right? It's like we may bump heads, but as long as we keep our wits about ourselves, we may come out with a much better product than we would have had we avoided the conflict. Again, working groups are a good example of this. If you leverage all those different personalities, you come out with great policies and such. So again, conflict doesn't always have to be bad, but we don't want to always avoid it. And then strengthening leadership through relationships. So we talked about that, and adaptability and flexibility. We talked about that. But again, emotional intelligence keeps you grounded in a lot of these different areas that are necessary in your supporting your resilience in becoming a thoughtful leader, because always there's going to be setbacks. This concept of the lizard brain. Anybody heard of this concept, the lizard brain? So the lizard brain is essentially what they like to call our primitive brain. This is like what they say we adapted as early human beings. When human beings face threats like these, let's say like dinosaurs and such, where, there's complete darkness, there's all types of threats around that are, out to harm you or eat you. The theory is human beings develop this fight or flight. Basically, that's what it is, fight or flight. So whenever we get into these situations, it said we revert back to that primitive way of thinking. We want to protect ourselves, fight or flight. When we get in highly emotionally charged or threatening situations, we revert back. That's how when you encounter this, I think most of us, we know how it feels when you get frightened or when you feel yourself backed in a corner, whether that's in an argument or in some type of encounter, road rage or something, that feeling that you sink into, that's you going to that primitive brain, that primitive way of thinking. And what happens or what can happen if you don't, some of the worst mistakes are made or decisions are made when you allow yourself to react in a way that you should not react, in a way that you shouldn't react, because you're in that primitive way of thinking. So again, road rage incidents, somebody cuts another person off, and that person gets out and shoots the person that cut them off. Or in any situation, you're in the grocery store, somebody cuts you off in line, and then you yell out a curse word at that person because they cut you off. We can think about many situations where when we're in that fight or flight response, the best things don't tend to happen. But again, you're going to encounter this as a thoughtful leader quite often. And you really need to know and recognize that there's a concept that I'll talk about later. It's called being in the basement. That's what they call it. You need to recognize when you're in the basement, in that way of thinking. And this is where I think like mindfulness and stuff like that comes in. You might need to, whatever techniques you want to use to help yourself not respond in a way that might be unbecoming of you as a thoughtful leader, you want to practice those types of things. I remember when I was in a negotiating class, there was a technique where you sort of pinch the inside of your thumb and your finger or whatever. Like I tried it, didn't really work for me, but the negotiator was saying when he felt himself getting very emotional and backing into that fight or flight response, he would do that, pinch himself, and that would help him recognize that it was at that point he didn't need to respond. He needed to think. Again, thoughtful leadership. You need to think and gain some clarity. Let yourself come out of that as best you can, come out of that before you issue a response. So that's what we mean by recognizing when you're in that space. So I want to talk about some real world scenarios that I've encountered. They're based on some things that I encountered and just your thoughts on it. So in 2004, I was promoted to the rank of staff sergeant, was serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. And this is my first position in my leadership journey that required me to directly supervise other individuals. So I was 22 years old. So shortly after the promotion, I was deployed to Iraq. So one of the individuals I supervised, and this is not his real name out of respect for that person, was Airman Reed. So throughout the deployment, Airman Reed experienced major challenges waking up for our assigned shifts. He would set alarms, but he'd sleep through them. And I would constantly have to wake him up. So one day I grew frustrated and opted not to wake him up, to teach him a lesson. So about an hour later, Airman Reed showed up for his shift and he was visibly upset. And he wanted to know why I left him. So I just want to, based on that, for you all, what are your thoughts on that? And how would you have approached him as he's standing in front of you, visibly upset, wondering why I left him? Let me hear your thoughts on that.
Dr. Fielder, I like this scenario because you are posing me to think about myself in these positions. And in the case of Airman Reed, I feel on one perspective that they're an adult and they need to grow up and take responsibility for their actions. On the other hand, though, I feel the mantra of am I my brother's keeper? And perhaps as I started, I should have finished. I'm a little torn with this scenario.
Okay, excellent. Appreciate that response. Somebody else, what are your thoughts? How do you think you would have responded to Airman Reed?
I would have held him accountable. I would have been direct with him in a very respectful way. We're here in it together. You are your brother's keeper. You are your sister's keeper. Just like I'm here, and I came here on time. You need to do the same thing.
Okay, excellent. So accountability. Anybody else? So I'll tell you what. So I'll tell you give you some context. And this again goes into having empathy and, really understanding the people you're leading and not viewing them as just a number or, not, so prior to the deployment, this particular person actually had to end up taking somebody's life. So before going to a war zone, and he's at the time 23 years old, I think. So he had to end up taking somebody's life even before going to a war zone. Like somebody broke into his home and tried to actually take his life. So he was forced to take that person's life. He was cleared of it. But the thing about it, the thing is, obviously, as we know mental health now, we recognize and understand more about mental health. Probably shouldn't have been, that soon going over into a high stress environment like a war zone. But nonetheless, he did. And me, I'm 22, so again, I'm still developing myself. But I know this, but I disregarded it. And what happened is that he was suffering from so much being in that environment, not only a war zone, but he's struggling with what he did. So he literally was sleeping through that alarm because he was psychologically, his body was fighting in so many different ways. I mean, his alarm would be blaring. I found it very odd that he wouldn't wake up. The point is that it goes back to what I was saying is that I knew he had that issue, and he was a great person, hard worker, great guy, top of the line. He was all of those things. He was accountable and everything else. But this is why I say emotional intelligence and being thoughtful, it didn't really hurt me to go bang on his door and get him up, like make sure he was up. It didn't take anything from me to do that because I would have expected the same thing if I had some type of issue like that. So once again, it's understanding what is going on with your team and being empathetic and being open and vulnerable with them. Because he was open and vulnerable with me, I knew what was going on with him, and it took a lot for him to, express that and explain what was going on. And I let him down in that situation. So that's one of my earliest dealings with, this whole concept of thoughtful leadership and emotional intelligence development. So again, that's just one of the earlier things that happened to me that I carry with me to this day that helps me think through, when I'm making certain decisions and I'm dealing with my team members.
Dr. Felder, this is so exciting. Can I just interject and share some of the things that we have in the chat? I know that we are getting close to our hour, and I want to be respectful of time. Would you mind if I shared some of the chat with you?
Go right ahead.
Excellent. So we did have a contributor that shared that they learned how VUCA, or volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity landscape can be countered by the building blocks of resilience. They really enjoyed that part. We also shared how positive self-talk, strong relationships, cognitive flexibility, and EI, through your words and teaching, it helps us to reframe the situation and assist us in moving forward. We also had highlights when we were speaking about the scenario with the airmen about asking how could we help them arrive on time. That came into play with your accountability aspect. Tony shared with us that now that he knows all the details, he would have rethought his approach as more of a therapeutic one. And we really enjoyed the scenarios that you brought forth because it stresses the importance of knowing your teammates and your people. This is a phenomenal event.
I appreciate it. And I appreciate all the great feedback. And yeah, definitely, like I said, definitely be respectful of time. I will just basically tell you, if you look at this meta leadership, this is a good concept to read more about it. It starts with the person, which again is you. And it's leading down, which is leading if people report to you. It's leading beyond, which I'll say leading across, which is dealing with your colleagues and your peers in your organization. Leading beyond, which is dealing with people outside. And then leading up, which is influencing the people above you. And then obviously the situation, which this is a crisis leadership model, but this is where you start that they preach to you, or the concept is you start employing all of this before a hurricane comes into play, because that's when you're going to have to put all of these things together to learn how to lead and be a thoughtful leader. And so this is my contact information for anybody who wants to reach out to me. I think, sorry, that's a little hard to read. It's Dr. J-Way LLC at gmail.com. And my website should be back up in the next couple of weeks. I'm revamping it, but it's www.drjway.com. And I do, executive coaching and leadership development, and I love doing these types of workshops, and because I'm very passionate about leadership and seeing others grow and develop. So really love that.
Hats off to you, Dr. Fielder. I would be remiss if I did not highlight some of the aspects that you've shared. Some of our key takeaways that we saw today is that we had great questions, engaging dialogue, and memorable takeaways. For example, I really enjoyed hearing about the conflictologist and how using conflict can cause one to become better. A second one that your wisdom brought forth is the scenarios with Corey and his anonymous complaint, as well as Airman Reed's behaviors, and having us take a second look at how we would respond. And thirdly, the attributes of thoughtful leadership, including self-resilience, emotional intelligence, and creating a personal leadership development plan. I'm very pleased how you brought forth your email address of Dr. J-Way LLC at gmail.com. And as we have in the chat, we have our workshop evaluation link. We also have other kudos and congratulations to you, such as great presentation. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Well,
We at the Black Duck, go ahead.
I was saying thank you all for that feedback. I appreciate that.
We at the Black Doctoral Network are so proud to have you speak with us, and we would really like to invite you to come back again. Would you consider that for us?
Oh, most definitely. And again, I love leadership, love conflict, a lot, anything dealing with conflict. and just again pouring back into and developing others. That's a strong passion of mine, and love to do it in any way that I possibly can. So have me anytime. I will definitely respond and jump right back into it with you.
Outstanding. Thank you. And we'll probably take you up for it. So on it. So leave your calendar open in the future.
I shall.
We appreciate you, sir.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. As we are completing the evaluation survey that's posted in the chat and copying down Dr. Fielder's contact information, I would like to take the time to highlight our upcoming workshops at Black Doctoral Network. The first one that I want to call your attention to is that if you visit us at blackphdnetwork.com, repeat it, blackphdnetwork.com, you'll notice that we have our BDN National Conference. If you haven't purchased your tickets yet, it's the 12th Annual Black Doctoral Network National Conference, taking place October 17th through 19th of 2024 at Loyola Marymount University in beautiful Los Angeles, California. If you did purchase your tickets, outstanding. We'll see you there. And then to highlight our upcoming events, seen at blackphdnetwork.com/events. Our next workshop series will be led by Dr. Derek Smith on the topic of understanding the intersection of high school and college. That will take place on Wednesday, October 16th. Our second event that's coming up is the BDN Recruitment and Resource Fair. Our exhibitors can register by October 17th. And then we do have undergraduates promoting research opportunities and professionalism, including education and leadership, a conference on October 17th. Once more, to follow us there and learn more, visit us at blackphdnetwork.com/events. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Dr. Fielder for sharing wisdom, and we will see you all soon.